The bus hissed and groaned as it pulled away from the curb, leaving him standing alone under a too bright autumn sun. The suitcase at his side was a cheap, hard-shell thing, a gift from the social worker. It contained everything he owned: 3 changes of clothes, a worn toothbrush, and a single, carefully guarded treasure wrapped in an old T-shirt. He looked up. Whitmore Academy wasn't a school. It was a fortress of ambition and old money. Gothic stone buildings clawed at the sky, and perfectly manicured lawns stretched out like green velvet. The air even smelled different here, clean and crisp, tinged with the scent of expensive mulch and distant, echoing bells. For a kid who'd spent the last 3 years bouncing between temporary bedrooms in noisy, crowded homes, the silence of the place was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. His name was Leo, and he was 16. He'd been given a scholarship, a word that felt both like a key and a curse. It was a merit-based opportunity for the underprivileged, the letter had said. He knew what that meant. He was the project, the charity case, the proof that Whitmore was as enlightened as its glossy brochures claimed. He was shown to his dorm, room by a student monitor who didn't bother to learn his name. The room was a double, but the other bed was stripped bare, a desk empty. He'd learn later that his intended roommate, upon hearing about his background, had been swiftly moved to another hall. Leo unpacked his meager belongings into the giant oak dresser. Finally, he unwrapped the T-shirt. Inside was a small laminated photograph of his mother, her smile blurred at the edges, and a slender, well-used metronome. He set them carefully on the desk. The first week was a lesson in quiet exclusion. His clothes were clean, but obviously from a discount store, a sin in a sea of designer casual. He spoke when spoken to, which was almost never. He ate alone at a long table in the cavernous dining hall, the clatter of silverware and the bubbles of laughter from other tables forming a wall around him. The classes were brutal, a relentless sprint where everyone else seemed to have been born knowing how to run. Then there was music class, the Whitmore Conservatory. Building was a separate palace of glass and polished wood. The practice rooms had soundproof doors that hushed the world. Mr. Alden, the music teacher, was a man in his 60s with a kind, tired face and fingers that were permanently slightly curved, as if always ready to find a chord. He'd heard Leo's audition tape, a recording of a Beethoven sonata played on a public library's out-of-tune upright piano. The tape had crackled with noise, but what had come through the static was undeniable. A raw, breathtaking feeling that no amount of perfect technique could fake. Leo, Mr. Alden said on that first day, gesturing him into a practice room with a beautiful black Steinway. This is yours. 3 hours a day, scheduled. The mid-state classical competition is in 2 months. I've entered you. The mid-state. It was the biggest thing a high school musician could aim for. Winners got noticed by conservatories, got real scholarships, got a future. Leo just nodded, his throat tight. He sat at the Steinway for the first time, the cool ivory-like skin under his fingertips. When he played a simple scale, the sound was so pure, so resonant, it felt like the piano was singing from inside his own bones. This was the instrument he dreamed of, while his fingers ached on cracked plastic keys in group homes. The sound, however, did not stay a secret. The other music students, a tight-knit group who'd been taking private lessons since they were toddlers, heard him. They heard the emotion, the strange, untamed passion in his playing that contrasted sharply with their own polished, precise performances. It threatened them. It annoyed them. It was, in their world, an offense. The ringleader was a senior named Clayton Thorne. Clayton had the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no. He was a technically proficient pianist, destined for Juilliard, and he saw Leo not as a person, but as a stain on the pristine fabric of Whitmore's reputation. A foster kid, here on a pity pass, Daring to touch the same keys he did, the mockery started subtly. A snide comment about his shoes outside the practice room. A mysteriously missing sheet of music from his stand. Leo absorbed it all, head down, his only response the music he poured into the Steinway. His focus became the Ballade No. 1 by Chopin, the competition piece Mr. Alden had chosen. It was a storm of a piece, full of longing and fury and a desperate, beautiful sadness. Leo understood it in a way the notes on the page could never explain. One afternoon, after a particularly good session where the music had flowed out of him like a second breath, he left the practice room to get a drink of water. When he returned, the door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room felt different. The air was still. His piano, his beautiful resonant Steinway, was gone. In its place stood another piano. It was just as grand, just as impeccably black and polished, gleaming under the track lights. For a second, his heart leapt. Had they given him an even better one? He walked over and lifted the fallboard, revealing the keys. They were pristine, white as new teeth. He pressed middle C. Silence. He pressed it harder. A dull, hollow thunk came from inside the body, the sound of a piece of plastic tapping cheap wood. He ran a frantic scale up the keyboard. Thunk, 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 thunk. Nothing but a series of empty, dead clicks. It was a prop, a stage piece. A beautiful, expensive, utterly fake shell. His hands fell to his sides. He stood there, the silence of the room pressing in on him, 1,000 times heavier than before. He understood the message with a clarity that hurt. This wasn't just a prank. This was a statement. Asterisk, you do not belong here. Your music is not real. You are a fake, so here is a fake instrument. Now, perform. Asterisk, he heard a stifled giggle from the air vent. He didn't look. He slowly closed the fallboard over the silent keys. He pulled out the bench and sat down. He straightened his back, set his hands in his lap, and stared at the music on the stand. The complex, swirling notes of Chopin's Ballade. Then he began to play. His fingers moved over the silent, fake keys with exact precision. His shoulders rocked with the phantom dynamics. His face held all the intensity of performance, eyes sometimes closed, brows knitted in concentration during a difficult passage. He played the entire first movement in perfect, utter silence. The only sound was the faint whisper of his fingers on the slick plastic and the soft, rhythmic click of the non-functional pedals under his feet. When he finished the movement, he stopped, his hands hovering over the keys. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He didn't cry. He didn't smash the fake piano in rage. A strange, cold calm settled over him. They thought they were mocking his dedication. They didn't understand that for him, the music had never lived in the piano. The piano was just a machine. The music lived in the dark, quiet space behind his eyes, in the memory of his mother humming, in the relentless beat of his own heart. It lived in the silence between the notes of his own life. He opened his eyes. He had 2 months until the competition. He had a fake piano, and he had a piece to master. He set the metronome on top of the piano. He didn't wind it. He just looked at its still pendulum. Then he turned back to the silent keys, placed his fingers, and began the second movement. The silent practice became his secret ritual. Every day, at his scheduled time, Leo would enter the small, soundproof room, close the door on the world of Whitmore, and sit before the beautiful, useless object. At first, it was a struggle of mind over muscle. His fingers, trained on real pianos, craved the feedback of sound, the vibration of a hammer hitting a string. They felt stupid and disconnected, tapping on the unyielding plastic. He'd close his eyes, try to hear the music in his head, but the silence in the room was a heavy blanket, smothering the notes before they could form. He almost quit a dozen times in that first week. The urge to slam the key lid down and walk out, to give Clayton and the others the satisfaction of seeing him break, was a physical ache in his chest. But then he'd think of Mr. Alden's quiet, disappointed face. He'd think of the social worker who'd fought for this scholarship. He'd think, most of all, of the one thing he had that they didn't, a lifetime of practicing in his head. Growing up, real pianos were rare treasures. He'd sneak into church basements or linger in a department store, getting in 10 stolen minutes before being shooed away. Most of his practice happened on tabletops, on his knees, on the edges of textbooks. The music had always lived primarily in the theater of his mind. This was just a more extreme version of that. He changed his approach. He stopped fighting the silence and started using it. He became a scientist of the piece. He broke the Chopin ballade down into fragments, bar by bar. At night, in his quiet dorm room, he'd listen to recordings on his cracked phone, an earbud in, following along on the sheet music he'd spread on his bed. He wasn't just listening for the notes. He was listening for the breath between the notes, the hesitation before a stormy run, the slight decay of a chord. He scribbled in pencil on the sheet music, not just fingerings, but feelings. Asterisk, remember the gray sky from the car window. Asterisk, like running down the stairs. Asterisk, quiet, like before a storm. Asterisk, then, in the practice room, he would work. He'd play a single silent chord on the fake keys, holding his hand in the exact shape, pressing down with the exact weight, while in his head he heard the rich, complex sound bloom and fade. He'd do this for hours. A single phrase could take an entire session. His focus was so deep, so complete, that he'd often leave the room with a stiff neck and a feeling of being mentally drained, as if he'd just run a race. He started to notice details he'd never have caught on a real piano. On a real instrument, the sound could cover up small mistakes in fingering or timing. Here, in the perfect silence, every flubbed finger turn, every moment of rushed rhythm was exposed. He was forced to be perfect. The fake piano, in its own cruel way, was becoming the strictest teacher he'd ever had. Outside the room, the performance continued. Clayton and his friends would sometimes check in. They'd linger outside the door, listening for the silence, then walk in with exaggerated concern. "Everything okay in here, Maestro?" Clayton would ask, leaning against the doorframe. "Piano sounding good?" Leo would just nod, his hands resting on the silent keys. "It's fine. You sure?" "We don't hear much playing." A smirk would play on Clayton's lips. "I'm working on the dynamics," Leo would say, his voice flat. "The quiet parts." This would usually get a chuckle from the group as they left. They thought he was in denial, clinging to a pathetic fantasy. The story of the foster kid earnestly playing a dead piano became a beloved joke in the dining hall and the senior lounge. Leo heard the whispers. He felt the eyes on his back. He ate his meals, did his homework, and walked the halls like a ghost, his inner world growing louder and more vivid as the outer world wrote him off. The only person who seemed to see something else was Mr. Alden. The old teacher would sometimes pass by the practice room window. He'd see Leo inside, his body coiled with a tension that spoke of immense effort, his fingers flying in precise patterns, his face a mask of deep, almost painful concentration. There was no sound, but the boy's entire being was playing. It was unnerving. One afternoon, Mr. Alden intercepted Leo in the hallway. "Leo," he said, his voice low. "My office, now." In the book-lined office, the teacher didn't sit. "What is going on in that practice room?" he asked, not unkindly. "I'm practicing, sir," Leo said, looking at a point on the wall behind Mr. Alden's head. "I hear nothing. Week after week, I hear nothing. The competition is in 6 weeks. You cannot learn a Chopin ballade on a silent piano." "It's not silent to me," Leo said, and the simple truth of it hung in the air. Mr. Alden studied him. He saw the dark circles under the boy's eyes, but also a new steely sharpness in his gaze. "Let me hear you on a real piano, the one in the main hall." Leo's stomach clenched. That was a public space. Anyone could walk by. "I'd rather not, sir. My process, it's private right now." "This isn't about privacy, Leo. This is about you being set up to fail. If someone has tampered with your instrument, you need to tell me." Leo met his eyes for the first time. "The instrument is fine, Mr. Alden. It does exactly what I need it to do." Frustration flashed across the teacher's face. He was trying to help, but the boy was walling him out. "You're being stubborn. You'll walk onto that stage and humiliate yourself. Is that what you want?" For a second, the calm mask on Leo's face slipped. A flash of something hot and defiant showed through. "I won't be humiliated," he said, his voice quiet, but with a finality that stopped Mr. Alden short. "I promise." He left the office. Mr. Alden sank into his chair, troubled. He knew cruelty when he saw it. He suspected the fake piano, but without Leo's complaint, his hands were tied. All he could do was watch as the boy marched, day after day, into that silent room. It looked less like delusion now, and more like a kind of solemn, strange discipline. It scared him a little. Back in the practice room, Leo sat down. The frustration from the meeting with Mr. Alden buzzed in his veins. He channeled it. He opened the music to the coda, the final, furious, technically insane climax of the ballade. He placed his hands over the dead keys. In his mind, he unleashed the storm dot. His fingers became a blur. His torso twisted with the force of the phantom chords. His foot worked the dead pedal in a frantic, silent rhythm. He could hear it. He could hear every single crashing note, the wild, chaotic cascade, the final resolving chords ringing out with a power that shook his ribs. It was more real than any sound a piano could make. It was alive inside him. When he finished, his hands fell into his lap, trembling slightly from the imagined effort. He was breathing hard, as if he'd truly just played it. A single, unexpected tear traced a hot path down his cheek. It wasn't from sadness. It was from the sheer, overwhelming force of the music he had just conjured, fully formed from nothing but silence and will. He wiped his face quickly. He looked at the fake piano, no longer an object of mockery, but his own strange tool. They had given him a cage, thinking it would imprison his talent. Instead, he was using the bars to practice his escape. The tension in the air at Whitmore thickened like fog. The mid-state competition was a week away, and the usual pre-contest buzz was laced with something else, a cruel, whispered anticipation. Everyone in the music stream knew about the silent boy in practice room 3. To some, he was a sad joke. To a few others, watching from the edges, he was becoming something unsettling, a quiet question mark they didn't know how to answer. Leo's world had shrunk to the size of his own mind. He moved through the hallways like a sleepwalker, his fingers constantly tracing invisible scales on his pants leg or the edge of a textbook. He ate without tasting his food, his ears filled with phantom orchestrations only he could hear. The Chopin ballade wasn't just memorized. It was etched into his nerves, a map of muscle memory and emotion he could navigate blindfolded. The fake piano was no longer an obstacle. It was his accomplice. Every silent session was a rehearsal for a performance happening somewhere else, in a perfect soundproof auditorium inside his head. Clayton, however, was growing bored. The joke had grown stale. Leo's calm acceptance, his refusal to break or complain, had robbed the prank of its satisfying ending. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to see the facade crack. The day before the competition, Clayton found his moment. Leo was leaving the practice room, his worn backpack slung over one shoulder, his face pale with concentration. Clayton stepped into his path, flanked by two of his usual followers. "Big day tomorrow." "Leo," Clayton said, his voice slick with false cheer. "Nervous? Excited? Ready to finally let us all hear this masterpiece you've been composing?" He gestured with his thumb back toward the closed door of room 3. Leo tried to step around him. "I have to go." Clayton shifted, blocking him. "Go where?" "To mentally practice some more." He laughed. "Come on. We're all curious. Give us a preview. Right here, right now." "I don't have a piano," Leo said, his voice low. "Of course you do." Clayton's eyes lit up with malicious glee. He threw an arm around Leo's shoulders, a gesture that was both friendly and imprisoning. "Your beautiful practice piano is right in there. Let's have a little recital." He steered a resistant Leo back into the practice room. A few other students, smelling drama, gathered at the door. Clayton pushed Leo toward the bench in front of the sleek black instrument. "Sit, play. We're your audience." Clayton crossed his arms. A smirk plastered on his face. Leo stood rigid, his back to the small crowd. He stared at the piano. The silence in the room was different now, charged, waiting. He could feel their eyes on him, hungry for his humiliation. The old, familiar heat of shame started to crawl up his neck. This was what they wanted, to see him finally admit it, to beg for a real instrument. But then a strange thing happened. He thought of all the hours in this room. He thought of the music that had grown in the quiet, stronger and more real than any noise. The heat of shame cooled, hardening into something else. Something solid. Slowly, deliberately, he sat down on the bench. He didn't open the piano. He just sat facing it, his posture perfect. Then he turned his head and looked directly at Clayton. His face was calm, but his eyes held a clarity that made Clayton's smirk twitch. "I don't need to play it for you," Leo said, his voice clear and carrying in the small room. "I already know how it sounds." Clayton barked a laugh. "What? You've lost it." "The piano's a prop, Leo. A fake. It's been fake for weeks. You've been playing a toy." He announced it to the room, finally ripping away the pretense. A ripple of giggles and shocked whispers went through the onlookers. Leo didn't flinch. He nodded slowly, as if Clayton had just confirmed something obvious. "I know." The two words sucked the air out of the room. The giggles died. "You know?" Clayton repeated, thrown. "I knew the first day you put it in here," Leo said. He reached out and gently lifted the fallboard, revealing the pristine, silent keys. He pressed one. Thunk. The hollow sound was absurdly loud in the quiet. A piano is just a box. Wood, wire, felt, and glue. It's a machine. He let the fallboard down softly. The music was never in here. He tapped the glossy black lid. Then he pointed to his own temple. "It's in here. And in here." He placed a hand flat over his heart. The simplicity of the statement, the utter lack of anger or embarrassment, was disarming. Clayton stared, his prepared taunts stuck in his throat. He'd expected tears or rage or a broken confession. He hadn't expected this quiet, unnerving certainty. "You're crazy," Clayton finally managed, but the words sounded weak, defensive. "Maybe," Leo said, standing up. He shouldered his backpack again. "But tomorrow, I'm going to use a real machine. And you'll hear the difference." He looked not just at Clayton, but at the faces peering in from the hallway. There was no challenge in his gaze, just a simple, stark truth. The machine doesn't make the music. The person does. He walked toward the door. The small crowd parted for him without a word. He didn't look back. The story exploded. It wasn't just a joke anymore. It was a strange, complicated scandal. By dinner, everyone at Whitmore knew. The scholarship kid had been practicing on a dummy piano for weeks, and he'd known it the whole time. Whispers swirled. Some called him an idiot. A very few, started whispering the word genius. Mostly, there was a deep, unsettled curiosity. What had he been doing in there all that time? The headmaster, a man whose primary concern was the school's reputation, heard the rumors and panicked. He summoned Leo to his office that evening. Mr. Alden was there too, his face grim. "Leo," the headmaster began, steepling his fingers on his massive desk. "This situation with the practice piano is deeply regrettable. An appalling lapse. The students responsible will be dealt with." He cleared his throat. "However, the optics of you competing tomorrow, given the circumstances, it could be perceived as, well, a spectacle. It might not be in your best interest, or the school's." Leo stood quietly. He understood the man's meaning perfectly. Mr. Alden leaned forward. "Leo, he's offering you a way out. You can withdraw. Cite illness. No one would blame you. In fact, it might be the wiser, more dignified choice." The headmaster nodded eagerly. "Yes, dignity. That's the word. Avoid any potential embarrassment." The office was warm, lined with books and trophies, a monument to success. Leo felt 1,000,000 miles away from it. He thought of the silent keys, of the music that had become more solid than the furniture in this room, of his mother's blurred smile in the photograph on his desk. He hadn't come this far to choose someone else's idea of dignity. He looked at the headmaster. "Sir, with respect, the only embarrassment would be not playing. I've practiced. I'm ready." "On what?" the headmaster exclaimed, throwing his hands up. "On a piece of furniture?" "In my head, sir," Leo said. "Which is where it counts." The headmaster sighed, seeing his tidy solution slipping away. "Very well. But understand, you represent Whitmore Academy. Your performance will reflect on all of us." "I understand," Leo said. And he did. He was finally starting to understand exactly what he represented, and it had nothing to do with their stone buildings or their velvet lawns. Later that night, in the dark of his dorm room, Leo lay awake. The nervous flutter in his stomach was there, but it was small. Bigger than that was a solid, heavy feeling of readiness, like a weight in his core. He didn't need to imagine the performance anymore. He just needed to sleep, to rest the hands that had played 1,000 silent concerts. Down the hall, in a much larger room, Clayton was also awake, staring at his own ceiling. The triumph he'd expected to feel was absent. He kept hearing Leo's calm voice. Asterisk, the music was never in here. He'd wanted to prove Leo was nothing without a proper instrument. Instead, Leo had calmly claimed he didn't need one at all. For the first time, a sliver of cold doubt wormed its way into Clayton's certainty. What if the kid wasn't crazy? What if, in some impossible way, he was right? Tomorrow would tell. The real piano, the real stage, the real audience, they would decide. Leo finally closed his eyes, the ghost of a melody his only lullaby. He was ready to give his silence a voice. The Mid-State Classical Competition was held in the Old City Concert Hall, a place of faded red velvet and gold leaf that smelled of lemon polish and quiet history. Backstage was a chaos of nervous energy-polished shoes squeaking on linoleum, the rustle of satin dresses, the frantic, whispered scales of violinists warming up. Competitors hugged instrument cases like lifelines. Leo stood apart, near a heavy velvet curtain. He wore the one good suit he owned, a dark, slightly too big thing the social worker had helped him find. It felt stiff and foreign on his shoulders. In his hands, he held nothing. No sheet music. He didn't need it. The pages were burned into his mind. The Whitmore contingent had arrived in a clatter of confidence. Clayton and the others were dressed in tailor-made suits, looking like a magazine spread. They huddled together, casting occasional, unreadable glances toward Leo. Mr. Alden stood nervously off to the side, his face pale. He gave Leo a small, tight nod when their eyes met. It was a nod that said, "Well, here we are." From the other side of the curtain, Leo could hear the other competitors. A flawless, sparkling Mozart sonata. A technically fierce Prokofiev piece that sounded like racing locomotives. Each performance was met with polite, measured applause from the judges and the audience. This was a world of precision, of cultivated talent, of everything Leo was not. A stagehand with a headset whispered his name. "You're on." Leo walked to the edge of the curtain. His heart was a frantic bird in his chest. For a terrifying second, his mind went blank. The months of silent practice, the certainty he'd felt, it all vanished, leaving only cold, naked fear. He looked out at the stage, and there it was. Centered under a single brilliant spotlight was a concert grand piano. It was a creature of deep, resonant black, its lid propped open like a giant, graceful wing. The ivory keys seemed to glow. It was more beautiful, more imposing, more real than any piano he had ever seen. This was no practice room Steinway. This was an instrument for giants. The fear didn't leave, but it changed. It sharpened into a single, clear point of focus. This was the machine. And he knew the music. He stepped out from the curtain. The walk to the piano felt miles long. The audience was a dark, murmuring sea. The judges sat at a long table, their faces illuminated by small reading lights, pens poised. He saw none of it in detail. His world had narrowed to the path to the bench. He sat down. The leather of the bench was cool. The silence in the hall was absolute waiting. He adjusted the seat, a simple, habitual movement. He wiped his slightly damp palms on his pants. He placed his hands in his lap, took a slow, deep breath, and closed his eyes. In that darkness, he wasn't in a concert hall. He was back in practice room 3. He felt the familiar, unyielding plastic of the fake keys under his fingertips. He heard the perfect, utter silence. He felt the ghost of all those hours, all that concentrated will, gathered inside him like a storm held in a cup. He opened his eyes. He placed his hands on the keys. The feel was alien. The real keys had a give, a liveliness, a slight roughness under his fingers. They were waiting. He pressed a single soft bass note. The sound that came out was so rich, so deep and complex, it vibrated up through the bench and into his bones. It was a physical shock. It was the first real piano sound he'd made in 2 months. A soft gasp, almost a sigh, escaped him. In the front row, Clayton leaned forward, a faint, derisive smile on his lips. "He's forgotten how," the smile said. Leo ignored it. He placed his hands for the opening chords of the Chopin Ballade. He thought of the gray sky from the car window, the feeling of endless movement toward an unknown place. He began. The first notes were tentative, searching. They were quiet, a question murmured into a vast space. But as his fingers found their places, memory took over. Not just muscle memory, but the memory of emotion. The silent practice had scrubbed the piece clean of physical habit. Every note was now a deliberate choice. He wasn't playing the piano. He was remembering a feeling. The loneliness of the bus ride to Whitmore. The hollow thunk of the fake key. The weight of 100 silent meals. He poured it into the quiet, lyrical opening. The music wasn't just pretty. It was aching with a story. The judges, who had been sitting back, subtly straightened up. This was different. This wasn't Chopin played. This was Chopin lived. Then the music began to turn. The storm was gathering. Leo's body, trained on the silent, motionless prop, was free. He leaned into the phrases. His shoulders rolled with the rising passion. The piano responded to every nuance, every shift in weight he'd only imagined before. The crescendo built, not just in volume, but in raw, emotional force. He hit the first turbulent run. On the faked piano, this had been an exercise in silent precision. Now it was a waterfall of sound, every note crystalline and fierce, tumbling out with a breathless, desperate energy. It was technically flawless, but the technique was invisible. All anyone could hear was the feeling dot in the audience. Mr. Alden's hand had come up to cover his mouth. His eyes were wide, glistening. He wasn't hearing a student. He was hearing an artist who had forged his talent in a fire of ridicule and had emerged with something pure and terrifying. Clayton's smile had vanished. He sat rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped his knees. He heard it. He heard the difference. This wasn't just good playing. It was a language he didn't speak. It had a depth, a pain, and a soaring hope that his own perfect, practiced performances never touched. The silent weeks hadn't been empty. They had been a crucible. The ballade roared toward its famous, devastating coda the part. Leo had practiced in a frenzy of silent fury. Now he let it loose. His hands were a blur, a controlled explosion on the keyboard. The sound was immense, a torrent of harmony and dissonance that seemed to shake the very air in the hall. It wasn't angry. It was triumphant. It was the sound of silence breaking. He played the final, crashing chords, each one landing with the finality of a closing door. Then the last, quiet, resolving note. It hung in the air, pure and simple, fading slowly into nothing. He lifted his hands. The silence that followed was of a completely different kind than the one he'd left behind. It was stunned. It was full. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a judge in the center, an older woman with silver hair, began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate sound. Another judge joined. Then another. Then, the entire audience erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roaring wave of sound. People were on their feet. They weren't clapping for a perfect performance. They were clapping because they had been taken somewhere, because they had felt something real and raw and beautiful. Leo sat at the bench, breathing heavily, the vibrations of the last chord still humming in the air around him. He looked at the piano, the real, glorious machine that had finally given voice to his silence. He gave it a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then he stood up. His legs felt weak. He turned to the dark, roaring sea of people and gave a short, stiff bow. As he straightened, his eyes found the Whitmore section. He saw Mr. Alden, openly wiping his eyes. He saw the other students, their faces a mix of shock and awe, and he saw Clayton. Clayton wasn't clapping. He was just staring, his face pale, his expression one of utter, complete defeat. He hadn't been beaten. He had been shown a country he never knew existed. Leo walked off the stage, the applause washing over him like a warm tide. Back in the wings, he leaned against a cool concrete wall, closing his eyes again. The storm inside him was quiet now. He had done it. He had translated every second of that silent, lonely practice into a sound that could fill a hall. He had taken their fake piano, and with it, built something utterly, undeniably real. The applause chased Leo all the way back to the dim, cluttered backstage area. It echoed in his ears, even as the heavy velvet curtain swung shut, muffling the sound to a dull roar. He leaned against a cool brick wall, the adrenaline draining from him so fast his knees felt shaky. A stagehand gave him a thumbs up and a wide grin. Someone else clapped him on the shoulder as they rushed past. It was a blur of noise and shadow. He didn't feel like a champion. He felt empty, in the best possible way. The music that had lived inside him for so long, the storm he had nurtured in silence, was finally gone. He had given it all away to that dark hall. All that was left was a quiet, humming peace. The other competitors looked at him differently now. The polite, distant curiosity was gone, replaced by a kind of wary respect. They had heard it, too. They knew what had happened out there wasn't just another good performance. He found a quiet corner and sat on a wooden crate, waiting. The results took an hour. An hour of sitting with his own thoughts, hearing the faint sounds of the final competitors. The distant, polite applause. Mr. Alden found him once, squeezing his shoulder wordlessly, his eyes still red-rimmed. No other Whitmore students came backstage. Finally, they were all called out to line up on the stage. The lights were brighter now, harsh on his face. He could see the audience clearly. The Whitmore group was in the third row. Clayton stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. The head judge, the silver-haired woman, stepped to the microphone. She spoke about technical excellence and artistic promise. Then her tone softened. "Today, we witnessed something beyond technical mastery," she said, her gaze sweeping across the line of students and landing, for a moment, on Leo. "We witnessed a reminder that music does not reside in the instrument. It resides in the spirit of the musician. It is communicated through skill, yes, but it is born in experience, in resilience." She announced third place, then second. A tall cellist from a rival school stepped forward, smiling gracefully, and the first-place winner of this year's mid-state classical competition, the judge said, pausing, is a performer who gave us not just a composition, but a story. She said his name. The sound that came from the audience was different this time. It was warmer, filled with a genuine joy. Leo felt a push from the student next to him. He walked forward, his steps automatic. The judge shook his hand, her grip firm, and placed the heavy crystal trophy in his arms. She leaned in close, away from the microphone. "Wherever you found that," she whispered, "don't ever lose it." The flash of cameras was a sudden, blinding storm. He stood there, holding the cool weight of the trophy, squinting into the light. He didn't smile for the pictures. He just looked out, feeling the strange distance between the boy in the too big suit and the roaring crowd. The bus ride back to Whitmore was silent. A different silence. The boisterous confidence of the morning was dead. Clayton and his friends sat at the front, speaking in low murmurs. Leo sat at the very back, the trophy in the seat beside him like a silent passenger. Mr. Alden sat across the aisle from him, not speaking, just sharing the quiet. When they pulled up to the Gothic buildings, dusk was painting the sky in purple and orange. The headmaster was waiting on the steps, his hands clasped. He forced a smile as the students filed off the bus. When Leo stepped down, trophy in hand, the headmaster's smile became more genuine, though his eyes were calculating. "A proud day for Whitmore," he said loudly, putting a hand on Leo's back for a photo opportunity. Leo just stood stiffly until it was over. He went straight to the practice wing. He needed to do one last thing. He walked down the familiar hall, past the closed doors of other rooms, to room 3. He unlocked it and flicked on the light. The fake piano sat there, sleek and absurd under the fluorescent glow. It looked smaller now, like a toy. He walked over and placed the heavy crystal trophy right in the center of its polished lid. The ridiculous contrast, the gleaming award on the silent prop felt right. It was his final word on the matter. The next morning, a school-wide assembly was called in the main auditorium. A buzz filled the room. Leo was told to sit in the front row. The headmaster gave a speech about integrity, community, and the indomitable Whitmore spirit. It was vague and grand. Then he called Mr. Alden to the podium. The old teacher walked slowly, his notes clutched in his hand. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of young, waiting faces. He didn't smile. "You have all heard by now about a remarkable victory," Mr. Alden began, his voice gravelly but clear. "But this assembly is not to celebrate a trophy." He paused, letting the room grow still. "It is to address the cruelty that attempted to prevent it." A nervous rustle went through the crowd. For nearly 2 months, a student at this school was given a fake piano to practice on. A prop, a silent, empty shell. He spoke plainly, without drama. He was given this while preparing for the most important competition of his life. This was not a prank. It was a calculated act of malice designed to humiliate and break a person's spirit. He looked directly at the section where Clayton sat. The boy had gone pale, staring at his shoes. The individuals responsible know who they are. They will face consequences. But that is not my main point. He turned his gaze back to the whole room. My point is what happened next. Instead of breaking, this student practiced. In silence. For hours every day. He built a masterpiece in the quiet of his own mind. And then he showed us all what real strength looks like. He showed us that talent is not something you buy or something you can mock away. It is something you carry inside, and no one can touch it unless you let them. He turned and gestured for Leo to stand. Reluctantly, Leo rose. "This," Mr. Alden said, "is not a victim. This is a musician. And he has taught this old teacher, and hopefully this entire school, a lesson we desperately needed to learn." There was no applause this time. Just a deep, shamed, and thoughtful quiet dot in the days that followed. Things changed. The fake piano disappeared from room 3. In its place was the best of the school's Steinway concert grands. A note taped to it that simply read, "For the musician." Leo was given a master key to the practice wing. Clayton and 2 others received suspensions and were required to complete community service. But the real change was subtler. Students didn't suddenly become his friends. The social divide at Whitmore was too deep for that. But the open mockery stopped. When he walked the halls, the whispers that followed him were now of curiosity, not cruelty. A few brave souls from the orchestra even asked him for advice on their pieces. He gave it, quietly and without fanfare. One afternoon, he found a small envelope taped to his dorm room door. There was no name. Inside was a single sheet of expensive stationery. On it, in neat, slanted handwriting, were the words, "I heard the music." "I'm sorry." He never found out who sent it, and it didn't really matter. He kept the trophy on his desk, next to the photograph of his mother and the silent metronome. He looked at it not as a symbol of winning, but as a receipt. Proof that he had traded his silence for something solid. He still practiced for hours every day. But now, the grand piano sang under his hands, a partner to the music in his head, not a replacement for it. He had learned that the music was his alone. It was forged in the foster homes, on tabletops, and finally, in a silent room with a fake piano. No one could ever give that to him, and no one could ever take it away. The elite school had tried to mock the foster kid with a silent instrument. And in doing so, they had unwittingly given him the quiet he needed to hear his own voice, loud and clear, for the very first time. His victory wasn't in the crystal or the applause. It was in the unshakable knowledge he carried within him now. He was the music, and that was enough.